During the night the wind rose. As I had lain reading, I had become aware of the stronger gusts that blew every so often against the casements. But when I awoke abruptly in the early hours, it had increased greatly in force. The house felt like a ship at sea, battered by the gale that came roaring across the open marsh. Windows were rattling everywhere, and there was the sound of moaning down all the chimneys of the house and whistling through every nook and cranny. At first I was alarmed. Then, as I lay still, gathering my wits, I reflected on how long Aylmarch House had stood here, steady as a lighthouse, quite alone and exposed, bearing the brunt of winter after winter of gales and driving rain and sleet and spray. It was unlikely to blow away tonight. And then those memories of childhood began to be stirred again, and I dwelt nostalgically upon all those nights when I had lain in the warm and snug safety of my bed in the nursery at the top of our family house in Sussex, hearing the wind rage round like a lion, howling at the doors and beating upon the windows, but powerless to reach me. I lay back and slipped into that pleasant, trance-like state, somewhere between sleeping and waking, recalling the past and all its emotions and impressions vividly, until I felt I was a small boy again. Then from somewhere out of that howling darkness, a cry came to my ears, catapulting me back into the present and banishing all tranquillity. I listened hard. Nothing. The tumult of the wind, like a banshee, and the banging and rattling of the window in its old, ill-fitting frame. Then yes, again, a cry. That familiar cry of desperation and anguish. A cry for help from a child somewhere out on the marsh. There was no child. I knew that. How could there be? Yet how could I lie here and ignore even the crying of some long dead ghosts? Rest in peace, I thought. But this poor one did not, could not. A few moments I got up. I would go down into the kitchen and make myself a drink, stir up the fire a little and sit beside it trying to shut out that calling voice for which I could do nothing, and no one had been able to do anything for. How many years? As I went out onto the landing, Spider the dog following me at once, two things happened together. I had the impression of someone who had just that very second before gone past me on their way from the top of the stairs to one of the other rooms, and as a tremendous blast of wind hit the house so that it all but seemed to rock at the impact, the lights went out. I had not bothered to pick up my torch from the bedside table, and now I stood in the pitch dark blackness, unsure for a moment of my bearings. And the person who had gone by, and who was now in this house with me, I had seen no one, felt nothing. There had been no movement, no brush of a sleeve against mine, no disturbance to the air. I had not even heard a footstep. I had simply the absolutely certain sense of someone just having passed close to me and gone away down the corridor. Down the short narrow corridor that led to the nursery whose door has been so firmly locked and then, inexplicably, opened. For a moment I actually began to conjecture that there was indeed someone, another human being, living here in this house, a person who hid themselves away in that mysterious nursery, and came out at night to fetch food and drink, and to take the air. Perhaps it was the woman in black. Had Mrs. Drablow harboured some reclusive old sister or retainer? Had she left behind her a mad friend that no one had known about? My brain span all manner of wild, incoherent fantasies as I tried desperately, to provide a rational explanation for the presence I had been so aware of. But then they ceased. There was no living occupant of L Marsh House other than myself and Samuel Daly's dog. Whatever was about, whoever I had seen and heard rocking, and who had passed me by just now, whoever had opened the locked door was not real. No, but what was real? At that moment I began to doubt my own reality. The first thing I must have was a light, and I groped my way back across to my bed, reached over it and got my hand to the torch at last, took a step back, stumbled over the dog who was at my heels and dropped the torch. It went spinning away across the floor and fell somewhere by the window with a crash and the faint sound of breaking glass. I cursed but managed, by crawling about on my hands and knees, to find it again and to press the switch. No light came on. The torch had broken. For a moment I was near to weeping tears of despair and fear, frustration and tension, as I had ever been since my childhood. But instead of crying I drummed my fists upon the floorboards in a burst of violent rage, until they throbbed. It was Spider who brought me to my senses by scratching a little at my arm and then by licking the hand I stretched out to her. We sat on the floor together, and I hugged her warm body to me, glad of her, thoroughly ashamed of myself, calmer and relieved, while the wind boomed and roared without, and again I heard that child's terrible cry borne on the gusts towards me.